Hi, everybody. Welcome to the American Library in Paris. I am Rachel Donadio. I am the curator of cultural programs here, and it is a great honor and a pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for Justinien Tribillon in conversation about his book, The Zone, with Aaron Peck. How many of you are here for the first time? Great. Welcome, newcomers, to the American Library in Paris. We are the largest English language lending library on the English continent. We are an independent nonprofit organization, and we host events like this and have a collection of nearly 100,000 books. Please become a member and come back and join us another time. Justinien Tribillon and Aaron will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So without further ado, I will introduce the speakers and let them get on their way. Justinien Tribillon is a curator, writer, editor, and educator with a transdisciplinary practice including social sciences, photography, architecture, history, and design. He recently published The Zone, an alternative history of Paris, Ruderal, Liquid Identities, and Visible Upon Breakdown. Justinien is a lecturer in history, theory, and criticism at the École nationale supérieure des arts décoratifs, otherwise known as Art Déco, in Paris. He received his PhD in urban studies from the Bartlett University College, London. Aaron Peck is the author of Jeff Wall, North and West, Letters to the Pacific, and The Bewilderments of Bernard Willis. A literary and art critic, he writes regularly for the Times Literary Supplement and Aperture magazine. Please join me in giving them a big round of applause.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Justine. First of all, I want you, I'm being told the microphone, is this better? Okay, first of all, I want you to imagine the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He is gathering flowers, and he's going on a walk south of Paris. And he crosses the gate to get out of the city. You may recognize this. It's from his sixth walk from the Reveries of the Solitary Walker. And as he's crossing the gate, he realizes that he wants to kind of take an alternate route because there's this young woman who sells, and I love this detail, she sells herbal tea, little bread. This is, pre-viennoiserie in France, so like a sweet kind of baked good, and fruit. And she has a small child. And Rousseau had, until this point, always walked through the gate, saw them, and gave the little boy a little bit of change and would walk on. At a certain point, he didn't want to keep giving them change, so he snuck around in order to find a different way out of the city. And he talks about this, and it's an incredibly beautiful passage wherein Rousseau describes the sort of shame we feel at witnessing another's suffering but not doing anything about it. It's also an incredibly fascinating, to me anyway, depiction of Paris, because that gate that he goes through was at the time called Barrière d'Enfer, which of course now, not in the exact same location, but close to it, is what we in Paris call d'Enfer Rochereau, one of the great kind of central nodes of the south of Paris. And here we have this sort of description of the city at an earlier point, at its edge, just beautifully described. Now, Justinien's book, The Zone, he's written about a similar limit, one that defines what's outside and inside of Paris, the Périphérique, this sort of the ring road which encompasses the city. It's the first of its kind, he tells me, to explore Paris's ring road as an understanding of the city of Paris itself. And it's a compelling urban history that looks at this area and particularly focuses in on a literal historic space that was called the zone. And so I wanted to ask you first, could you tell us a little bit about what the zone was?
Thank you.
Push up.
Push up this. So I was just saying, sorry for that mic issue. Thank you very much, Aaron, for that opening little story, and thank you very much for having me tonight and for being present. The zone, indeed, and the story that you just told is part of that story of that history of this space called the zone, which is kind of a buffer space between Paris proper and the suburbs. The Porte d'Enfer, the gate to hell, that Jean-Jacques Rousseau did cross back in his days, indeed still exists, and until very recently it was the entry into the quarries, the subterranean quarries to Paris, so also a double entendre there in terms of going into hell literally and going under the city literally. But at the time, what you had in the 18th and 19th century, and for most of the 19th century, you had on the edges of Paris, you had a wall, but it was kind of a light wooden wall that you had to cross, indeed, to leave the city, to formally leave the city. Most of it has been removed. D'Enfer Rochereau is one of those points that still stands today. La Rotonde de la Villette, the Rotunda of Villette by the Place Stalingrad is one of those. Also at Place de la Nation, you have those big, you have those two kings placed on very tall pedestals, and at their feet you have the tall houses of that former wall. And I've recently learned, scrolling on Instagram, that you actually have social housing within those tall houses, so you can live there. So that was a wall that was purely for tax purpose. The main aim of this wall, which was very light in its architecture, was to collect tax on goods that came in and out of the city. A first element to bear in mind, and I'll come back to that, is that this tax survived until 1943. So you have to bear in mind that until 1943, arguably, though I suppose it was really easy to avoid that, if you left in the morning with your car and a tank half full with fuel and came back in the evening with your full tank, you had to pay a custom tax on the half tank that you brought back into the city and that you had purchased at a lower fare outside the city proper. What happened in a very interesting manner is that this wall came down later in the 19th century and was replaced by something which is much more heavy duty and actually a military infrastructure. So in the 1840s, and this has been a long developing story, starting with Napoleon's being defeated in 1814, Napoleon's being defeated in 1815, and both times the Prussian armies and their allies entering the city of Paris and humiliating Parisians and the French army by parading on the Champs-Élysées. Long debate happening throughout the first half of the 19th century, and in 1840 finally is voted a decision to build all around the city a military fortification, which was meant to protect Paris against invasions. There's two aspects that I want to bring up. First is to try and picture the fortifications it represented. We're talking about, and I'm sorry I don't know yards, we're talking about 100 meters in depth for what is now today the Boulevard des Maréchaux, the Marshal's Boulevard, so literally the little path inside to make sure to have the army forces being able to move around the city. You then had a fortification armed with cannons that was roughly 150 meters in depth. You then had a dry moat, which again was a typical military device in the landscape to make sure that you had a clear vision to shoot at invading forces. And on top of that, you had an area which was not eligible for construction, which is called in French zone non edificandi, which is Latin, which is a legal term to say that it was not allowed to build. The reason for it is just typical military strategy. When you fortified towns in France in the 19th century, you had a series of concentric rings, 3 rings. I will spare you the details, but the first ring was meant to remain devoid of any construction in order to shoot at invading forces. What happened, though, in the case of Paris is that very quickly, for legal reasons that I will again spare you tonight, we can talk more about legalities, but it is very much a legal issue there. A law that was not properly redacted, a law that was not properly enacted, meant that this very quickly became a grey zone where, even though it was formally forbidden to build anything by military orders, Parisians, the less privileged of the Parisians and those in the suburbs, started to build little shacks there that then became little cottages, as we named them at this time, that then became slightly stronger and bigger houses, that then became little buildings, etc., etc., but also factories, theaters, cabaret, and a whole array of public and private facilities. And what's really interesting there is that it became an area both for living and for a wide diversity of population, mainly the less privileged and the less wanted within the city proper, and we can come back to that. But it also became a place for entertainment, a place for pleasures, and a place of ill repute, prostitution obviously, but also kind of a reputation of being a place where you can get stabbed, also a place to hide when you want to hide from the police. So it became a mix of an area that was very much a place where people lived, but also a fantasied zone, fantasied area that was a place that the bourgeois wanted to go to kind of, entertain themselves and give themselves a thrill, a taste of bougie Paris. And this is the first step in the creation of the zone, which is both very much a concrete, architectural, physical space, but also a myth.
But and a historical one specifically then, because basically you in the book you track you sort of understand it to be a myth, right, as you just say, but it was at that point real.
It was at that point real.
Yeah. And then exactly, because you've just described that. And then hold it up. All right. And then later, this is one of the things I find really fascinating about the book. So it's effectively a book about the Ring Road in some sense, or is it a book about the zone which uses the Ring Road? In other words, it's about this infrastructure, which I think you call at one point in the book the biggest infrastructure, I'm probably only paraphrasing at this point, but biggest infrastructure project in Paris in the second half of the 20th century. And that is the Périphérique freeway itself. And yet it's sort of unseeable in a certain sense as this large infrastructural monument. It's not, for example, the Eiffel Tower. It's a freeway. And yet you make this point that it is this massive monumental structure. Now, so one of the things that I find really interesting about the book is this push and pull between this historical space and then the freeway that becomes of it, could you say a little bit more about the tension between those two things?
There are different relationships there. The first one is maybe personal, because I did do my PhD on the ring road itself. So, this is one of those nerdy PhD research that we do, which is you first want to do a PhD about the history of Paris over 300 years, and then you ended up walking about 17 years, which is already big enough, I would say. And so I did my PhD on the ring road of Paris. And as an anonymous, technocratic infrastructure, and indeed a very quiet monument. It's an oxymoron, but it's on purpose, because as you just said, you paraphrased very nicely, I do think that it's one of the largest effort in terms of urban planning and infrastructure construction in Paris in the 20th century. It is about 36 kilometers of ring road going all around the city and deeply changing its landscape, and for many, many years to come. And as you can see, if you live in Paris and you follow French news, but not only, if you also follow news in English, it's a topic of contest. As soon as you touch on the number of lanes that's on the ring road, as soon as you touch on the speed limit on the ring road, all of a sudden, hell breaks loose. What's really interesting with the ring road, it's that it's a mix. It's a layered. It's an onion. It's a very complex entanglement. This is a word I love. It's an entanglement of very different design and historical issues. The first is that obviously it's an architecture which is quite heavy. It's a ring road. Sometimes it goes underground. It's quite rare, and it goes underground quite close to here. We can come back to that. But usually it's either at ground level or it goes into viaducts, which are heavily impacting the local areas, obviously. It's also, so that's for the physical contemporary aspect of the ring road. But the ring road itself came as a replacement to those military fortifications that I mentioned earlier. And this is where it starts to mix up with the myth, but also with the physical divide that survived in space in Paris in the 20th century and up until today. So if I go back to that story of those fortifications, which is called in French le mur de Thiers, because it was built by a politician, a reactionary politician called Adolphe Thiers. Excuse me. What's really interesting is that very quickly, the French public opinion and even its elite realized, even its soldiers, even its military elite realized it was a useless wall. And there is a debate amongst historians and it's a very interesting debate, and it's a very good peek into what actually is critical historical research, is that we do not know, and we don't necessarily have a common opinion as to was this wall truly built as a military defense, or was it built as a way to control the Parisian and to enclose the Parisians within a fortress that you could as well protect, but you could also shut down, and that you could also fire into. And there's a map I love to show, and that's in the book, which is a depiction of the fire range of the cannons surrounding Paris. And you can see that the cannons can cover the whole of Paris and can very easily shoot at the population. And this is what happened to an extent with the Paris Commune in 1870, which was, at the time, the chief of the government was Adolphe Thiers. So we have the same person who would repress the commune, and he would use the fortifications he had built himself, not himself, but that he had ordered to be built against the commune. And what's happening with this debate around the wall, and I will not tell you the whole story, or we can come back to maybe some specific aspects. That wall is being taken down. This is a decision. So the wall is built in 1840, in 4 years. Very intense construction work. From 1882, there is a decision that the wall needs to come down. Everybody agrees that it's useless. the wall is effectively brought down from the 1920s until the 1930s. So it takes 10 years to take it down, and it takes 40 years, 40, to negotiate the breaking down of the wall and very much the real estate deal that will take place between the central state and the city of Paris about this huge amount of land which is going to be released by the destruction of the wall. And there are two aspects, maybe two main physical results from that. The first one is a ring of social housing, what we call HBM, so Habitation Bon Marché, so the first version of social housing in Paris. Mainly those red bricks buildings that you see all along the Marshall Boulevards if you cross, if you leave the city proper. So this is the first iteration built in the 1930s, roughly. So this came to replace the fortifications themselves. And then outside the former fortifications that have been replaced by the social housing, you had the zone. And in place, in lieu of the zone, from 1956 until its completion in 1973, came the ring road itself. And this is how you have the myth of the zone, the myth of the edges and the margins of the city proper of Paris, and it's in relationship to its suburbs, and we can come back to that as well, the relationship between those two entities. And you have the factual, the physical, the architectural reality of a ring road, a motorway, the first urban motorway in France. So this is the first of its kind in France. You have to, again, we can come back to that, we can discuss more about this, but you have to imagine that people could not even picture until they had traveled to the United States, that could not imagine what a motorway, urban motorway, would be like, literally driving past their windows. This was a new technology, a new invention, a new design, so to speak.
Yeah, well, okay. One thing we haven't mentioned that I think is kind of interesting that you mentioned in the book is that the ring road was originally a Vichy proposal, modeled after the German Autobahn, right? So it has this connection to that history of fascist architecture, that kind of thing. But I wanted to, before asking you another question that's kind of developing off of some of the things we're talking about here, quote you, because I think it's a really very succinct description of, I think, something you're getting at in this book, right at the end. And you say, spatial design is always political. And I think you're kind of showing us that in the way you're describing this. And you talked about that image you have in the book of the cannons. And so there's an interesting relationship in this book that I'm talking about, a kind of like not quite a paradox, but the sense of how do you picture this thing that's not pictured, particularly in a city like Paris. We all have our images of Paris, right? In fact, you have this incredible passage on page 5 that I was kind of wondering if I could get you to read, where you talk about the images of Paris. Could you do that? And then I have a question.
Now, yes?
Yes,
sure.
Please, yeah. You know the one I mean, correct?
I think so.
Yeah. Voila.
Should I start from the beginning?
Yeah,
or?
yeah, those two paragraphs.
When I give talks about the urban planning of Paris to a non-Francophone audience, I like to start by listing the French words and expressions that attendees can come up with. From bonjour to voulez-vous coucher avec moi ce soir, from croissant to je n'ai pas compris, from Moulin Rouge to banlieue. This has always fascinated me. In which other languages can you say suburbs? Would you come up with Vorort in German or Soborgo in Italian? Paris is a myth known the world over, a global beacon of beauty, elegance, intelligence, culture, refinement, romanticism. It has been painted by the greatest, photographed by the most talented, described by the most gifted, visited by the most illustrious, loved by the grandest. There are millions of representations of Paris across the globe. it lives in Palermo, pinned on a teenager's bedroom wall, saving up for the big trip. In the dining room of a Mexico City retirement home, on the dashboard of a Malian taxi driver picking you up at the Modibo Keita International Airport of Bamako. Taped on the sliding toilet door of a flat in Kyoto. Hung above the clock in a train station in Kerala. Dangling from a keyring shoved in the front pocket of a backpack in Houston, Texas. That the actual Paris, the Paris I know, is a vile, dirty, stinky, feral, exhausting, pushy, aggressive city does not matter. That it is a city of immense energy and violence, that it spits on your face, kicks you in the butt, leaves you in the gutter, all of this does not matter, because Paris is an idea, a dream, a desire.
Thank you. Okay, so a couple things there. One question, and first a compliment. So I reviewed this book for a British magazine, Freeze, about a year ago, I think. We got the commission about a year ago. And I found when I was preparing for this, when I came back to your book, I liked it even more. And I was particularly drawn to your prose style. Your writing, I found it very compelling, and that's one reason I wanted us to hear some of it tonight. But okay, so first of all, you're writing in a second language, which is commendable because my French is hopefully charming, and it's definitely not literary. But so you've accomplished something there that I respect quite a lot. But I also noticed a current running through this book that is, to my mind, welcomingly, almost gleefully critical of France. And I wonder, did writing in English give you a freedom to write about France that you might have not had if you wrote about it in your mother tongue?
First of all, thank you for the compliments, Aaron. It's always appreciated. My relationship to English is, well, first of all, I moved to London. I was 19, something like this. So I lived 11 years in London. So I spent all of my 20s in London, which has been obviously your 20s are kind of formating, very shaping years, like important years of your life. I did a lot of my studies in the UK. And I also, that's where I discovered academic research and what it could bring to me. It's also where I started to write professionally. That's where people told me, you are good at this. Let me give you this gig or this commission to write. And this kind of gave me strength and energy to write and to continue. And the book also comes from being far away from home, and I think it's really good to go through those formative years far away from home, especially when from 0 until 20, I stayed in Paris and I grew up here. So it was very refreshing to be far away from home, and obviously to develop a relationship with English language, first through academic writing, which is a very specific type of writing, but also then to discover the pleasure of creative, non-fiction creative writing throughout the years, mainly writing for architectural magazines and The Guardian as well. And this is how, by pitching my first article to The Guardian, I pitched a series of different articles, and one of them was on the Ring Road of Paris, and the pitch that I had given back then was, this is a physical obstacle to the this is a physical obstacle to the development of Paris, and I'm going to write an article about this and the historical aspects of this. And I went back. The commission was accepted. The pitch was accepted. I went back to Paris to do my research, to do my study, to walk around the Ring Road, back to my hometown to write about it for an English newspaper. And this is where I realized that my prejudices were wrong. I realized that it was not an immense physical obstacle. It was actually really easy to cross, and that the biggest wall was in my head as a Parisian proper, born and bred. And this kind of blew my mind. And obviously, this was connected to ways of living in London, which is a very suburban city. You don't live in London proper. This is a really weird thing to do. You live in the suburbs, and all British, but all people living in London and myself, we all aspire to a nice Victorian or Edwardian house in the suburbs with a nice little decent garden and nice cafe by it. So it was for me a change, a profound change to what I had aspired to as a Parisian who grew up in Paris and whose only hope was to find a big flat in Paris and stay in Paris for as long as he could. So that's the first step, which is a challenge of the prejudices, of the spatial and the political prejudices I grew up with. And then the second step indeed was to write in English, to develop my writing career in English. And therefore, when I started to think about this book, and this is a book I pitched about a year before finishing my PhD, because I knew that I did not necessarily want to produce an academic book out of it. I wanted to produce a book about Paris talking to a wider audience. So in order to have this as my goal, I pitched before handing in my PhD to make sure that I did not lose my objective. And yes, writing in English has been liberating. Maybe because I knew that many of the people I know cannot read it, or at least need my intervention to read it.
That's I was wondering, right?
That being said, the book is coming out in French in June, so that's going to be a big step. Let's see how it goes, how it comes through into a French-speaking audience. But also, what has been really interesting for me is how writing in English in a language which that I've learned and that I do not know as intimately as French, or it's another type of intimacy, one that I have built myself over the years. It has, I think, cleaned my French from all the bad habits that I had acquired at university and in high school. And I think also today my French is better thanks to having done all this writing in English first and having embraced another language, and a language which I love, and it's always a pleasure to write in English and to speak in English as well.
Yeah, Anglophones are very of a certain literary kind are very quick to quote Wallace Stevens, who once said that French and English constitute the same language, which I don't agree with, but people love to say that as a way to say, yes, we're close. And, I feel that in my own, French language acquisition and in middle age, God forbid, my English did get better as well. So it's interesting that you say that. But so one of the things you were talking about how this sort of came out of an academic project, but you particularly wanted to write this for a general audience. And that's another thing that I think is so well done in this book is your use of archival research. And I have two questions, and we don't have that much longer, so I have many questions, but two here that I could dovetail from. And okay, yeah, I'm going to go with this one. I was curious about some of your selection in terms of archival material all the way through the book. But one thing that really surprised me, and I think this will help kind of wrap up this part of our conversation, was you discuss some well-known photographs of Eugene Atget, of the Les Aulniers. And seeing them in the book floored me, because I had always just sort of flipped by those images like, oh yeah, there's an image of the outskirts of Paris, but I had no context for those whenever I would sort of encounter those pictures that Atget had taken. And suddenly I saw them here in a way that I had never seen them, to the point that I had to go back and check my Atget books be like, oh, yeah, I do know those pictures. It's just I'd never known them within the historical context that you describe them. So I was curious a little bit about how you came to them for this, because I'm assuming, were they also just like some of the many other archival images, or was it like you were like, oh, I wanna bring in the renowned French photographer of Paris who also did the series on its outskirts?
This is a question I've never asked myself. This is why we do that kind of event. So thank you very much for that question. The pictures of Eugène Adjet, we say Adjet in French, I'm not sure why. Do we? No? Adjet? Adjet? Okay, this is me Anglicizing the name. Okay. These pictures, well, first of all, maybe it's one of those photographers we don't know how lucky we are to have them, and we don't know how lucky we are to have them so widely available, because Adjet, no, now I doubt it, so Adjet, on dit, c'est ça? Adjet, okay. See, we rediscover my own language.
Don't trust the Anglophone. You know, this is.
And so we've been really lucky because he's a photographer who has been spotted very early on by the surrealists, who have made, who have really worked hard to make sure that all of his production was saved, bought over by the Musée Carnavalet, I think. So they are available, they are very easy to access, they are widely digitized. And so therefore we all know them because they are very easily accessible. They are on, as soon as you Google Paris and Saunier, or Saunier Chiffonnier, you end up with those pictures. And so so they're really well known, but we have to bear in mind that we're really lucky to have them in a contemporary world where pictures are so widely available, but more and more corpuses or corpora of photographs are being digitized today, especially on the Bibliothèque nationale de France, Gallica, the online digital portal, where you have so many pictures available. And I wanted to go back to those pictures because they just give a beautiful vision and a non-judgmental vision of the Saunier, and they're not aiming at serving a political project, because a lot of those pictures might have been shot within kind of a social hygiene or public hygiene campaign, and therefore they are biased, or they serve the purpose for the public, the municipality or the public or the state. Neither they are shot by a journalist or news agency in order to make something sensational. And that's probably why this photographer is so well known and so appreciated up until today, because there are proper artistic eye on this Paris from the first quarter of the 20th century. As it happens, I'm also a curator, and I'm very much sensible to photographs, and I have always been. I am very much sensible to what we call industrial photography or commercial photography, and one of those projects is to reintroduce industrial and commercial photographers that have shot the Ring Road into the history of photography, because I think they were not known. They are not known as artists. They are known as artisans. Maybe they are known as commercial photographers who are fulfilling an objective, which is to give a kind of a neutral look at Paris, and in that specific case, at the Ring Road being constructed. And among those, there are some amazing and beautiful photographies which I want to share more widely. But there are some issues in terms of copyright. It's very hard to find who owns the copyright, because those photographs were shot for commercial studios, which obviously have all collapsed, and they all went bankrupt in the 1990s. And therefore it's really hard to publish them without risk, because it's really hard to find the copyright owners. That's why I've made the choice not to publish them in this book, but they are beautiful, and I hope to make an exhibition about them very soon. So it's a long-term interest into both anonymous photography, i.e. shot by photographers we do not know and whose career we don't know well, but also about shooting everyday life and everyday Parisians, everyday individuals in their tasks, in their homes. And this series of pictures is really, to that extent, is really beautiful.
That's fantastic. And you actually answered one of my other questions in that, and that was, what was some of the things in your research that you couldn't add to the book? Because that was something I wanted to know. So you answered that. But we're sort of at time for my questions for you. So I think we can open it up to the audience now for the last 15 minutes. I think there's a microphone going around, if anyone has questions.
Well, first, could we have a round of applause? Thank you. Who has a question? I saw some hands. All right. Come over here. Let's see, where was it?
Well, congratulations. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about a place which belongs to the banlieue, as we call it in French, recalling that this means literally lieu de mise au banc, which means the place for the outcasts. Well, it's the place that puzzles me now. It's my own place of residence. It's called Suresnes, well, besides the River Seine. And there's everything there which you described as being part of Paris proper. You mentioned, well, the possibility to defend the Parisians. Well, in Suresnes we have the Mont Valérien, well, with a big fortress, which was meant to defend Paris, to protect Paris from the Germans. Well, in 1870, that is. We have those, well, red brick houses, buildings which you mentioned, created by Henri Sellier, a former mayor of Suresnes. Well, it was called initially the Cité Jardin, the garden cities. We have former factories, and it's outside, Paris proper. So a question comes to mind. Well, who copied who, and who wanted to take advantage of who? And, well, can you shed some light, please? I'd like to have some sleep tonight.
Thank you very much for your question. Well, first of all, there's two aspects. There's several ways to answer your question. The first of all, is I like to always remind my audience, and that includes specifically a French audience, that the banlieue is diverse. Like, it's a very complicated and diverse landscape, both in terms of architecture, urban planning, the groups who live there. And when you mention the mot banlieue, often it is associated with working class, immigrant population, and modern architecture. Meanwhile, there are plenty of posh suburbs, to use British slang, and very affluent suburbs, and this is banlieue too, even though especially French speakers would not necessarily associate banlieue, the word of banlieue, with affluent suburbs. So that's the first aspect. And banlieue, there are many different banlieues. It is often referred in historic literature to Paris et sa banlieue, Paris and its banlieue, depending how you want to gender Paris. And this is something as well that says a lot. There is the Paris, the city proper, the city of power, the city of money, the city of government and politics, and then there are those subaltern territories that are servicing the capital city, so often having factories, often having power plants, but also a place to throw the garbage, the recycling plants, etc., etc. Everything is outside the city proper, and to a certain extent, the populations as well. Those working class, to use a term that's not so much in use anymore, but those working class who come back to Paris proper to clean, to serve, to school the children, to take care of the elderly, etc., etc., etc. And then there is the suburbs themselves are very diverse, and Suresnes has a long history. Henri Sellier, that you mentioned, is a key actor of developing social housing throughout the Paris region. Something to bear in mind without going too much into details either is that up until the 1960s, you had a department, so a local entity that was called la Préfecture de la Seine, the Département de la Seine, which included both Paris proper and what we call la Première Couronne, so the adjacent suburban town. So this was a creation of the French Revolution, and to a certain extent much more intelligent than what we have today, where we have broken down the préfecture, the Département de la Seine, in smaller entities which are harder to regulate and to organize urban planning there. The reason for that is that at some point in the 1960s, the left-wing parties, and specifically the communists, were about to take over the Département de la Seine, so they were about to be appointed, they were about to be democratically elected as the chief executive of the Département de la Seine, and to de Gaulle and their government, this was absolutely not acceptable. So in order to defuse that looming crisis, they broke down the Département de la Seine into several other entities, and they made a radical choice, which is to say there's one département which will always be communist, but there will be only one of those, and it's Seine-Saint-Denis. So we will organize the department in a way, kind of gerrymandering, as you would say in the US, in order to have all the communists in one place, and we know that they will never be able to win any other department, which was not quite true. They won another one, but to a certain point. And so Suresnes is part of that history. The fort that you mentioned is one of those forts that was able to shoot at invading forces, but also shoot at the Parisian, and it became a big place for resistance because it's a memorial for the resistance as well. And so Suresnes has a diversity of place, diversity of architecture. There's also beautiful houses for large families. There is also the museum for urban planning for the Paris region there. And so there are plenty of examples and counter-examples. And the whole of the banlieue, plural, the suburban cities, are a mosaic of examples and counter-examples of what the suburban identity is in Paris. And in truth, and this is why I try to say in the book, and not to go into cliches, but instead to deconstruct them, actually the banlieue is diverse and the banlieue is many, and Suresnes is one of those examples, and there are many other different places that echo that diversity.
Let's see, there was somebody over here, yeah.
Hi, thank you both so much for the talk. I wanted to ask about something maybe a little more modern day. So I know, of course, that Paris has kind of exploded out of its walls a few times, like starting just on Ile de la Cité, and then finally this kind of remnant of Thiers' wall with the Périphérique. So a few things are happening now where we're seeing metros I think it's the lines 16 and 18, which are going to be really focusing on just connecting banlieues together. You have the 14 getting expanded out. You have the normalization of the tariff recently, where you're not having to pay differently for RER, depending on how far you're going. To me, this kind of feels like a big way to kind of break down that what you described earlier as a mental barrier of okay, it's physically easy to cross the Périphérique, but you have this mental barrier of okay, but that's not Paris. So I'm kind of wondering what you think about the future. Do you think, is Paris right now kind of expanding out of what we're going to be actually considering Paris? I mean, understandably, the departments are going to stay the same, but do you, I guess, have any feelings maybe of optimism for that future?
Thank you for your question. if I go back to my experience of moving abroad and being back to Paris, so I mentioned London, but actually then I moved to Lille, which is a town north of France. I moved to Rome, and I've just been back to Paris for since September. So I left when I was 19, and I'm back now as 36 since last week. What I've found really fascinating traveling back and forth, being in London, back to Paris, is that I left Paris as a sleepy town. That's my opinion. Paris was really asleep, was a bit boring, was rested on on the past, both in terms of the cultural life, the cafes, the food, the restaurant. Everything was really sleepy and boring, especially when you compared it to London, which was kind of on the last leg of its kind of thriving years, I would say. This is my opinion. And so it was really refreshing to be in London, and Paris looked even more provincial than what I had found when I lived there. And it's been fascinating to see how Paris has changed massively. It is now back again, a very exciting town. I mean, it's, again, my opinion. I'm not trying to impose that on anyone. A very exciting town, plenty of culture, plenty of exciting new cultural venues that have opened, plenty of amazing restaurants, which are a far cry from the cliches about French cuisine and 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, whatever. It's booming, it's bubbling, it's bubbly, and I think as part of that process, Paris has exploded its walls, or to be more precise, I think there's a population, specifically my generation, but also and also of course younger generations, they now go out past the ring road. People are capable of going for a rave, going for a party, going for new restaurants, to take the tube, to take the bus, to take the bike and go past the ring road. And I think this was very exceptional when I was a teenager or when I was a young adult. It was really rare that we would go outside Paris proper to visit something that was worth visiting. It was part ignorance, and it was part also because there was the city proper and what was available there, and there was no desire or no curiosity to go past the ring road and that mythical wall. So that's part of the answer, which is that there is so much happening out there, and people are keen and eager to go out, and there's plenty of newsletters and magazines which are all about what's happening in the 9-3, what's happening beyond the ring road, and that not even review restaurants that are opening in Paris proper. And then the transport is indeed a very good reason, and there are all these new lines, and you mentioned as well this new fare, which is now a unique fare for the whole of the region, which is probably way more revolutionary than all these new lines, even though Parisians proper are not really happy because it increased dramatically for us, but still, this is really exciting. It's going to allow people to travel, we see, more smoothly, to go further out. You have to bear in mind that, among other things, we talked about this wall and this relationship between infrastructure and myth. The metro stopped at Paris proper, and it was on purpose. It's on design. It's because the RATP was in charge of Paris proper, and we were not supposed to, again, create or facilitate connection between Paris proper and the suburbs. The suburbs were the suburbs, and those living in the suburbs should not be able to travel freely and easily to Paris proper. And it's on design, and historians have documented that aspect of designing infrastructure for Paris. And then there's a third reason on top of that, and connected to that new metro system, or at least a widely expanded metro system being built right now, which is processes of gentrification. Paris is very expensive. It's a very expensive city. You probably all know that if you live in Paris. And therefore, it's logical that people, especially families, are crossing the ring road to live in suburbs which are more appealing, which are cheaper, which have bigger accommodations, bigger flats, etc., etc. There is a decrease today in Paris of its population, and there are school classes, especially primary and nurseries, which are closing down because there are no more young children in Paris proper, and especially in central Paris. One, the first, the second, the third, the fourth, etc., etc. So this is this is a mechanism as well, because as soon as you have friends moving out to the suburbs, you might join them, but you might also visit them, and they will discover the area they have moved to, etc., etc. Obviously, there is a major social and political issue there at stake, and the new metro system is only going to increase that. And there is a geographer called Anne Clerval who wrote a book in English about this, how all the real estate developed around the new metro station is all about developing for-profit housing for those who are most privileged, and not social housing for the locals and for the population who already lives there. So gentrification is both a way to open the territory, but it's also a way to kill it and to push back. And this is a very traditional process of gentrification. It's a donut kind of process. It's also a way to push back populations which cannot afford to live neither in Paris proper or in the immediate suburbs to Paris, to push them back further out and to create even more inequality across the space of Paris.
Let's take one more question.
Thank you very much both for the conversation. I've got one question about the green belt as one of the chapters in your book. Could you explain, according to your research, why there was no success in creating a park system instead of the ring of HBM and then later the ring road? So the political and urban planning decisions that led to the inexistence of these park systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. Indeed, the green belt, there's this whole big project of designing and delivering green belt all around Paris. So you had the HBM, but then that was a fairly easy transaction to carry out, in the sense that all the fortifications were owned by the Ministry of Defense, and they sold everything back to the city of Paris, which was then able to develop it. I will spare you, but I obviously write extensively about it in the book, about the whole process and the design that was embedded in that idea of designing first a ring of social housing and second a ring of green belt. I'm with those historians who think that this green belt and this ring of social housing was not necessarily about delivering comfort, hygiene, and leisure and a green space to the Parisians and the suburbans in order to create a connection, but instead to create a buffer to protect the real estate of Paris and keep it at very high level, which it's been very successfully doing for the last 100 years, and keep the suburbs cheap, and so make sure that those who owned in Paris remained rich and those who owned in the suburbs remained poor. I write extensively about it in the book, and I won't dwell too much on that, but to come back on your actual question on the ring road, one of the big challenges is that the zone, so the green belt was meant to replace the zone, but the zone was occupied. The zone was occupied by those informal housing, as we would say today, slums, as we would say back in the days, or bidonville, as we say in French as well, a term that is strongly, it's a teen city, but a term that is strongly connected to colonialism as well. And there were people there. We don't know how many, and that's a very fascinating field of inquiry, because historians, and there are many working on this. One of those historians is called Isabelle Bacouche, and she's probably one of the leading scholars in France on the zone. And we don't know how many people live there. We don't quite know their conditions, even though we have some leads, we have some ideas, but there is a demand for proper, in-depth academic research into the zone itself. But we know that these people were powerful just by their sheer number, and that the state was not so keen to remove them from the zone because it was very, very dangerous. politically speaking, you could have a revolution, a revolt. You could have people who would just outvote you outvote you as a mayor, or even as as an MP, a deputy, or as a president. So it was very dangerous to move this population, which was kind of organized and kind of powerful. There was a really long legal process that had been put in place. This legal process that was put in place in 1919 meant that the zone would have been totally empty by 1970. So it was a long process to make sure that people would negotiate, take the time to leave the zone, etc., etc. What happened, and Aaron mentioned it, Vichy arrives, so a non-democratic state, to say the least, so an autocratic state that is invested with a technocratic ideal, and among other things, very keen on urban reform, very keen on urban planning, very keen on architecture. And among the key projects they have is to get rid of the zone, get rid of those who live there, clean the zone and replace it with a green belt. Again, we don't quite know, historically speaking, the conditions for this removal. Were those who still lived in the zone in 1943, when the police and the army, French army, German army, we don't know, arrived, removed them. Where did they go? Were they rehoused? Were they deported? Were they killed? We don't know that. We need research on that. But the result is an empty space, but arriving quite late, and also at a moment where Vichy had no money, no material, everything was in shortage, including paper, and therefore there was no necessarily possibility to deliver on this dream of the zone as designed by Vichy, and something that had been envisioned for many years. And so we have this incomplete state of the zone. Some of it has been built. Stadia, as a kid, and I say it in the book, as a kid we used to go to Stadia by the Ring Road, because this is where all the stadia of Paris have been built. It sounds ridiculous, but back in the days it made a lot of sense. And there's another interesting aspect that took place then, is that we are in a mindset of landscape designers and road designers where a park and a road are not antithetic. They are kind of the same thing. To design a road is to design a vision, is to have a vision, is to design a green space. And so as part of those elements that could be included in the green belt, we have roads. So you could not build any buildings on the green belt, but you could build roads, because that served the purpose, and that served this imagination of the parkway, but also of German motorways, as Aaron mentioned earlier. And so this is the really weird aspect, is that the green belt has been delivered in the form of a motorway.